Election Day is November 3rd, but it is likely we won't know who will win until days or even weeks later. There's also growing concern the race will be decided in a courtroom, not at the ballot box. Both Republicans and Democrats have an army of lawyers ready, and hundreds of lawsuits have already been filed in nearly every state, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. Joining us now is CBS News reporter Melissa Quinn for more on this. Welcome, Melissa. Thank you for joining us. So President Trump has been attacking mail-in voting for months, claiming without evidence that it leads to voter fraud. What is the legal argument the GOP is currently making in court?
Well, the Republican Party and the Trump campaign, as you said, have really looked to the courts as a pretty powerful weapon that they plan to deploy ahead of the election. What we're hearing and seeing in these lawsuits is basically that the Republicans want to maintain the status quo. They're fighting hard against any effort, mostly by Democratic election officials, to expand efforts to make it easier for voters to vote by mail. They say that this could lead to fraud and really damage the integrity of the election. As you mentioned, there is very little evidence that that is in fact the case. The main concern also seems to be that in the states that have successfully implemented all vote by mail elections, we're talking Washington State, for example, it took them years to really perfect this system. We're looking at states who are seeking to usher in these changes in really a matter of months, and that is very alarming to Republicans and the Trump campaign.
So, Melissa, it does seem that the way people vote this year is just as important as who they vote for. The ACLU typically files 3 or 4 lawsuits around elections, and this year there have already been 20. What types of cases is the ACLU bringing, and why?
Yeah, you're exactly right. We are seeing a significant increase just from that one group alone in the number of lawsuits that they filed. In a normal election year, you would typically see the ACLU file challenges to the closure of polling places, for example, or signature matching requirements that some states have. This year, Dale Ho, who is the director of their Voting Rights Project, told me that almost all of their lawsuits are exclusively focused on absentee ballots and vote by mail. And what the ACLU's argument is really this is a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, and the states and the election officials in those states really need to make accommodations to ensure that voters can cast their ballots in a safe manner, whether that's showing up in person or through vote by mail, making sure that there are things like ballot drop boxes available, that they don't need a notary or a witness required to send in their absentee ballots. That is the area where a lot of their litigation is exclusively focused.
Right. And so, of course, it's both sides of the aisle have teams of lawyers ready. Republicans, the DNC, have hundreds of lawyers at the ready should this campaign season go past election night. What would you say is the lawyers' primary concern?
I think from the Republicans, it's really just making sure that there is no voter fraud taking place. And like we mentioned at the outset, there is very little evidence that that is the case. For Democrats, it really seems to be that making sure that voters can actually cast their ballots, have access to the ballot box, and can do so in a manner that is not a risk to their health. And you're right, we are seeing both the Republicans and the Democrats amass these huge armies of lawyers. Joe Biden said during a fundraiser over the summer that his campaign is hiring 600 lawyers and 10,000 volunteers to deploy all across the country. By comparison, the Republican National Committee and the Trump campaign are doing the exact same thing. They have set aside $20 million exclusively for these legal battles, are looking to hire 20 million, and are looking to hire 20,000 volunteers to deploy to key battleground states, being at the ready on Election Day.
Well, at least we know that the legal industry is doing well. All right. So, Melissa, we've talked about the lawsuits that are leading up to the election, but what about after November 3rd? I mean, if you go back to 2000, if you'll recall, it wasn't until December that the presidential race was ultimately decided by the Supreme Court. So should election night become election week or month? Could this wind up in court? And if so, for how long do you think?
That seems to be the exact scenario that election lawyers and election law experts are really preparing for. I spoke with one Republican election attorney who was part of the 2018 recount in the Florida Senate race, if you remember, between Rick Scott and Bill Nelson. She recalled that she had a family vacation planned for Thanksgiving. She ended up having to cancel it. She told me that she had joked with her family this year that they will be very lucky if they can see her at Christmas time. We're talking about one race in one state. This year, you are looking at potential court battles filed on and after Election Day, potentially in many states and all going on simultaneously in many races. The key there is going to be in how many states these legal battles are filed and crucially how close the election is. Obviously, one expert that I spoke with told me that the worst case scenario across all levels of government, from local election officials all the way up to the federal government, is that this does end up before the Supreme Court. He told me that that's not a scenario anyone wants, including the justices on the bench.
All right. Well, Melissa Quinn, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.